For the second part of this video on the 65mm C.R.A.P box Whoop build guide, we're going to be looking at flashing Betaflight to the board and flashing and setting up Project Mockingbird. And as you can see, this is Project Mockingbird in angle mode with me sort of mooching around my house, and I'm by no means a skilled pilot when it comes to whoops, but this thing flies really well with the Project Mockingbird settings, so we'll get going. One thing I want to say is that my recorder failed to record the initial part of this video, so I'll put the link to the Immersion RC flasher in the description below. So at this point I've double clicked on the Immersion RC driver fixer and I'm just letting it work its magic, which will put the flight controller into DFU mode and allow me to flash it with the latest version of Betaflight. I think it came with 3.21 or something like that, so I'm going to flash it with the latest version, which is 3.53. The Betaflight hex that this needs is omnibus, just a standard one, Omni, none of the later ones. So I'm just going to put this into I'm just going to start flashing this now, and you can see it's erasing the existing hex file, and then it will flash the new hex file and we'll be able to set up Betaflight 3.53. Right, so we've now connected it up. I've just quickly checked the orientation to make sure it's all okay, and the first thing I'm going to do is get my receiver working, and the receiver on this is on UART number 3, so we're just going to click serial RX for UART number 3 and then reconnect again. On these little boards sometimes Betaflight crashes, I don't know why. Sometimes you have to reconnect a few times or unplug the USB port. Right, so we're setting up the receiver. We want serial RX and then FR Sky, and then I'm just going to set the basic settings up. I haven't put air mode on because I want that on a switch, and we'll come on to that later on. So I'm going to go and turn motor direction reversed because I simply want the motors to spin the opposite way, which helps on little tiny whoops. We're going to leave gyro at 8K and PID loop at 2. And as I said, we're going to leave air mode off, OSD on, anti-gravity on and dynamic filter on. And we'll turn RX lost on. And we're setting up D-Shot at D-Shot 300. We don't need it really any higher than that. And minimum throttle at 4.8, and that's all we need for that. And we also set arming, max arming to 180, which will allow us to arm when the quad's upside down. I'm going to lower the minimum voltage and the max and increase the maximum voltage, just so I don't get any warnings flashing up on screen, because these batteries tend to sag really quickly. And then I'm just changing the receiver to TAER, which will stop it rolling around, and setting the aux channel as aux 12, which is RSSI on the XM Plus. And I'm just changing minimum throttle to 1020 and maximum to 1950. If you set it to 1020, it just takes away a little bit of the dead band at the bottom. Now I'm going to go into motors and just make sure all my motors spin up, and also make sure they're spinning the right way. So I want the front motors to spin outwards and the rear motors to spin inwards. which is the reverse of what they would generally be. Obviously, because this is a brand new flash, I'm going to have to go into BLHeli Suite and reverse them all. And at this point, I'm just setting up the OSD to how I like it. I don't like a huge amount on my OSD, so I'll just have the RSSI, battery voltage, a timer, craft name, and a minimum amount of warnings. And I'm setting the camera to NTSC, which is what most of these little cameras are. If you set it to PAL, sometimes you can't see your OSD. So I'm just moving everything around to where I like it. And I'm changing the timer to total alarm time and alarm at 3 minutes. And oh, Betaflight's had a bit of a hiccup. So we'll go back in again. And I'm turning off most of the battery warnings except the battery critical warning, because as I said, these batteries sag a lot, so we don't want it warning us every 2 seconds. And I'm just changing the typeface to clarity, which is my preferred OSD typeface. When this is finished, it will kick us out. Right, I'll have to wait for it to boot up again. Just checking everything works okay and double checking which aux channels I want to use. On my radio I use the 2 right hand switches for the majority of things and the left hand switch for crash over flip mode. So the way I want it is I want acro mode to be with all the sticks up. I want arming with 2 clicks on a 3 position switch on my right hand side switch. I want angle 1 click down on the next switch. I want beeper at the farthest point of the 3 position switch on the same aux channel. So basically aux 2 is going to give me acro in its up position, angle in its middle position, and beeper in its bottom position. And I want air mode on when I'm in acro mode, and I don't want it on when I'm in angle mode for racing. So I'm just putting that on the same switch so I don't have to think about it. And then I have to set flip over after crash, so turtle mode, to the very farthest point down on the 3 position switch on my left hand side. And this is where we're going to do the clever stuff. So we can assign the rate profiles to a switch. So when we basically switch between angle and acro, all our profile will change. Right, I've just opened BLHeli Suite and I'm going to connect and sort this motor orientation out. I'll put the link in the description below, but basically you just have to click connect, make sure you're on clean flight pass through, read setup, and the first thing we want to do, because this board is relatively old, is flash to the newest version. So we need to flash to 16.67, which will allow us to use D-shot commands and essentially allow us to use the motors as a buzzer, so we'll be able to use them to beep, although they're not very loud on little motors like this. So we're basically just going to flash all 4 ESCs with the latest version of Betaflight, and then when that's done we can change the orientation, because currently the front motors are spinning inwards and the rear motors outwards, and I want the reverse of that. So I want the front motors to spin outwards and the rear motors to spin inwards, which will help with cornering on these little whoops. Once all 4 ESCs have finished writing, we want to change all of the motor directions to reverse. So we'll just do that by clicking on the single ESCs at the bottom. So we'll click 1, change it to reversed and right setup, 2, change it to reverse and right setup, 3, change it to reverse and right setup, etc, etc. We don't have to change any other ESC settings at this point. although if I have issues with ESCs or motors starting up, I can increase the motor, the ESC startup power to probably 1.3 or 1.4, but I didn't feel it was necessary to do this. Now that the motors are spinning the right way, we're going to go back into BLHeli and start setting up the clever parts. So the first thing we're going to do is set the FPV camera angle to 10. And we want this to be roughly half of the camera angle of the quad. So because the camera angle of the quad is roughly around 20 degrees, or should I say roughly around 16 degrees, we want it at about 8. And this is part of the Project Mockingbird settings. So we'll come on to that in a second. Right, I'm just checking all those settings have finalised, and I'm going to go across to the PID tune, and I'm going to select rate profile number 2 and just check that everything's all okay, and then go back to rate profile 1. Now rate profile 1 is going to be our acro mode, so basically outdoors, and rate profile 2 will be in our angle mode, so indoors. So I'm just going to set some PIDs which I think will be okay based upon the Project Mockingbird settings, and these will be my freestyle or acro rates. I tend to use much higher Ds on these little guys. I would never on a larger quad run D in 40 odds. You tend to want them as low as you really can, or certainly no higher than sort of 30 odd. I'm going to set feed forward relatively higher than I usually do. On my freestyle quads I tend to be about 95. On this little guy, because it doesn't have the same amount of punch or power, I've set it to 120. And I'm going to set my RC rate slightly lower than I would do on a bigger quad, at 1.05, and my super rates at roughly the same level as I usually have them. And I'm going to add in a tiny little bit of expo just to soften the sticks around the centre mark, because these little guys can be twitchy. Adding in a little bit of throttle boost, which will help us when we're coming out of dives, just to spool up the motors quicker. And that's pretty much all I need to do on acro mode. Angle mode is where Project Mockingbird will start tweaking the settings a lot. And Project Mockingbird really relies on having completely linear sticks, linear rates. So basically by taking off RC rate and super rate and setting them to 0, the additional settings that we're going to put into the CLI shortly will give us the stick rate, etc., that we want. And because in Project Mockingbird you rely more on using yaw to turn, we want yaw a lot higher, but because we're not using any super rate, we've basically got yaw at around 618 degrees per second. And I'm just adding in a little bit of expo because I find these little guys a little bit twitchy. We're going to change the angle strength to 105, and basically what that will do is just allow us to drop the nose a little bit more than we generally would be able to do. We're going to leave the filters exactly as they are, just standard on Betaflight 3.53, and we need to be in rate profile 2 before we go into the CLI, because what we do in the CLI will affect just that rate profile. Now you'll need to be on expert mode to go into this, but basically what this will allow us to do is when we set this up, when we switch from position 1 to position 2, so from acro mode to angle mode on our switch, this will basically just change the rate profile at the same time. So when we're in the top position, in my case on the switch, we'll have the rates etc. for acro mode, and when we flip the switch down, we'll go into the settings and rates for acro mode or Project Mockingbird. So I'm just testing that now. And as always, when we've done this, we'll hit save. Basically I'm just flipping the switch on my radio to make sure it flips between rate profile 1 and rate profile 2. Right, I'm just going to add one of the additional settings in now. So I'm just going to change RC smoothing on to filter, which is a better form of smoothing. All that will do is just smooth out the any spikes. And now we're going to go into the CLI. We're going to type these commands in, which are the commands from Project Mockingbird. So the first thing we're going to do is set air mode start throttle %. If I can type. And all this will do is stop the sort of bumpiness you get on these little quads with air mode. The next two settings are really the trick of it. In the past, people would have used throttle mixes, etc., to change settings in angle mode. What we're going to do now is set the throttle correction value. What these settings basically do is when we turn, the quad will naturally give us a little bit more throttle, so you won't have to sort of power through the turns as much as you generally would have had to do. The quad will automatically, when you go into a turn, it will apply a little bit more throttle, which means it's a lot easier to fly. And that's really the secret of Project Mockingbird. It just allows you to fly really flat, and because you're using yaw to turn, you don't really have to use pitch as much as you would do otherwise. And the increasing PID sums, to be honest, I don't really see the point of this, but it's one of the settings. Apparently, because we're using higher PIDs than you generally would do, this just allows us a bit of headroom, but to be honest, I don't really see the need of it, but it was there, so I added it in. And that's pretty much it. So if you copy these settings just as I've done them in any sort of 65mm quad, whether you be on 16,000 kV motors or 19,000 like these, you'll have a pretty good setup. We might need to tweak it a little bit in acro, but certainly in angle mode it works really, really well. I'm just double checking these settings and making sure I've got VBAT PID compensation on. And then what I'm doing is, because the majority of the power on this little guy is in the upper 50%, I'm increasing the throttle midpoint and the throttle expo, so I get more power from that graph you can see at the bottom of the throttle where I want it, as opposed to at the very top where I won't really use it very much. And that is basically it. Shout out to the Betaflight FPV, to the Project Mockingbird guys, because obviously this is their baby. I haven't reinvented the wheel on any of this. I'm just using most of their settings, and they've worked really well for me on this little quad. This little guy flies brilliantly, actually, and I was a little bit worried about the frame when I first saw it, because it looks like the smaller version of the modular frame, which I've broken about 50 million times. But whether this is it's because this guy, the frame is a lot smaller, and thus the sort of cheap plastic isn't being spread over a larger diameter, I don't know. But in my lots of crashing with this little guy, I haven't broken it yet, and as you can see, I've crashed a ton of times. So yeah, so I hope this is useful for anybody. I've really enjoyed sort of flying this little guy around the house, and because it's smaller than the modular and the Emax Tiny Hawk, it's actually sort of better for this sort of flying. You know, 65mm is really the sort of sweet spot, and anything bigger than that in these sort of, you know, in a smallish sort of house like I've got in the UK, you know, it's the perfect sort of size. So anyway, that's it for this video. Sorry it's a bit monotone, but I'm just recording this in my onto my phone as I'm doing something else, but it should get your quad set up really well and flying really well. Cheers guys, thanks, bye bye.